How safe do you feel in the world today? Has the world been made safer, say, in the last 30 years by the people we've been raised to see as the good guys? I ask these questions sincerely, not least because there looks to be a UFO psyop underway in the United States by authorities that may, I would say, have literally thrown some balls in the air while they decide how to use them to push some or other part of some or other agenda. False flag, anyone? There's already talk of radiation leaks and enemy drones, so it's my prediction that anything could happen in the next 5 minutes. Another reasonable question might be whether this latest light show is just to distract us from what's unfolding in the Middle East. But in the meantime, let's take stock of some of what has happened in the past 30 years in the name of making the world safer. I listened this week to American academic, policy analyst and sometime advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Jeffrey Sachs, talking to journalist and broadcaster Tucker Carlson. It's worth noting in advance that both men have already been loudly criticised for what they said together. Sachs reminded everyone that what happened in recent weeks in Syria was the product of United States foreign policy going back to the 1990s.
It doesn't really matter who's president. This is long-term deep state policy.
He talked about how just after 9/11, US General Wesley Clark, heading NATO at the time, was summoned to the Pentagon and shown a paper detailing plans for 7 US wars in 5 years. Clark was, by his own testimony, stunned by the plan, could make no sense of it. But there you go, policy is policy. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia and Sudan all were in the US crosshairs to be knocked over one after the other. More interestingly, Sachs said that years before 9/11 and the fabled call for a war on terror, it was already the US intention to remake the Middle East. Let's remember the lies we were all told about Saddam Hussein's Iraq and weapons of mass destruction there. In 2002, Netanyahu lied to the US Senate on that very subject.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever.
Netanyahu and Bush Jr. and British Prime Minister Tony Blair knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but they all lied to the world about it anyway. Most interestingly of all, Sachs said that all of it, all those wars, trillions of dollars of expense, the ending of millions of lives, was carried out by the US on behalf of the State of Israel.
Israel has run American foreign policy in the Middle East for 30 years. That's how it works.
So that the ending of Assad's regime in Syria was hardly happening in some sort of vacuum. Rather, it was a penultimate step along a road laid down in the 1990s.
We've had 6 of those 7 wars. The only one that hasn't happened is Iran. And if you watch every day now, the MSM, the mainstream media, is pushing for U.S. war with Iran. Netanyahu's pushing for war with Iran.
Iran is the 7th of the 7. If Biden doesn't start war with Iran, it will be up to Donald Trump's administration to decide whether the grand plan is to be completed or not. It's impossible to know at the moment. There are voices in his proposed administration banging the drum for war with Iran. Octogenarian Senator Mitch McConnell has written recently about the necessity for the US to massively build up its military potential in pursuit of what he calls the primacy of the US, maintaining the position of the US as top dog. Others say no to war with Iran, but favour war with China. Others, again, say the US doesn't need war with anyone. It remains to be seen which voices will prevail after January 20th next year. Without deciding whether that policy of 7 wars for Israel was the right thing to do or not, I would say it matters a great deal to know the background. Otherwise, governments, their institutions, the mainstream media they control seek to operate as though the whole world has amnesia, that no one remembers anything from one event to the next, even when, especially when, those events are directly connected one to another. I ask again, does the world feel like a safe place now after all that effort, all those trillions of dollars spent, 6 wars so far, all those millions of lives sacrificed? Does the world feel like a safer place? The Doomsday Clock counts down the hours, minutes and seconds to the possibility of nuclear war. It isn't a real clock, it's a metaphor, a way of visualising how close we might be to nuclear Armageddon. It was first visualised in 1947, at the start of the nuclear age. In 1992, when Bill Clinton entered the White House, the Doomsday Clock had us at 17 minutes to midnight. In fact, the furthest mankind had been from global catastrophe in all the years since 1947. 17 minutes. Now, in December 2024, the Doomsday Clock stands at 90 seconds, a minute and a half from the end of the world. Regardless of what you or I might think, the Doomsday Clock thinks the world has never been more dangerous. There have been 4 presidents since Bill Clinton: George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Republicans and Democrats. As Jeffrey Sachs says, it has made no difference to the relentless prosecution of that same foreign policy of remaking the Middle East. According to Sachs and many other observers besides, this has at no point been in the interests of the United States of America. It has always and only been in the interests of Israel. Sachs' opinions are at least interesting to consider.
We have people in the U.S. who, in their mental blindness, think about continued escalation all the way to nuclear Armageddon. They really do. They're very ignorant people, and they're around in high positions.
He observes that Biden has not spoken to Putin since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. He estimates that despite the loss of perhaps 1 million Ukrainian lives, his estimate, I say, not mine, no one has lifted a finger in pursuit of peace there. Putin's Russia repeatedly makes plain it has red lines, positions, political and military, from which it will not back down. And the US loudly mocks those red lines, as though they are either certain Putin is not serious or because they don't care, all the way to nuclear war. And so it goes on, and the Doomsday Clock keeps ticking.
I think the Biden administration has been the worst of our governments in modern history. And that's saying a lot because I'm a complainer, so I don't generally praise administrations. Yeah. Like to think of myself as a responsible, tough grader, and I haven't given high marks to any administration from Clinton onward. I think they've all been failures. But Biden's administration has been a complete, shocking disaster, which has brought us closer to nuclear war, brought us into more conflict, didn't have one iota of diplomacy.
All around the West, here in Britain, people complain, justifiably, about the impact of uncontrolled immigration. But those millions of people are not on the move for nothing. In many cases, they come from countries deliberately destroyed or otherwise destabilized by those wars.
Just to go back to the 7 countries, because it's worth remembering, Lebanon, it barely exists as a functioning country right now. Syria, it's going to be picked to pieces. Don't believe. Well, it's obvious in what we're seeing every day. Territorial integrity, yeah. Israel's just invaded from the southwest into deeper Syria. Turkey from the north. Russia has its area. The United States and the Kurds have their area. This place is just going to be a battlefield for years to come. Iraq, we know what happened with Iraq. trillions of dollars, a complete destabilization of the country. Look at the other three wars. The United States broke apart Sudan. Why? Well, Sudan was an enemy of Israel, so we have to break apart Sudan. So we supported the South Sudanese. Now we have the real trifecta: massive civil war in Sudan and massive civil war in South Sudan. In other words, we broke apart the country, and now there's civil war in both halves of the country. Somalia basically doesn't exist as a country. Libya, it doesn't exist. It's a battlefield. It's a war zone. So that's 6 out of 6.
All of it creates nothing but chaos and death and an increasingly dangerous world. The Middle East is the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of Jesus Christ, arguably the birthplace of humanity itself. A person might reasonably ask if chaos and destruction are actually the goal, because that's all we get. So, do you feel safe in the world? Is the world a safer place? Decades of war on terror, that's what we're told, and yet the US has continuously and undeniably funded the terrorists: Mujahideen, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Assad's regime fell in the end to ISIS 2.0, funded by the US. Jolani, the leader of HTS, which is the rebrand of ISIS in Syria, has himself been rebranded by the West. A terrorist no longer, but a rebel instead, apparently. ISIS 2.0 is all about diversity and inclusion, we're told, so that's nice. Look back over those 3 decades and ask, who have we been fighting? Who have we been fighting for, and why? Who benefits from all those dollars spent, all those lives extinguished? We must ask these questions because somewhere a clock, a doomsday clock, is ticking.